Happy Thanksgiving, Module 4.2. Today we're going to take a look at the era of good feelings. Can you think of a better topic to talk about going into Thanksgiving than something that we're talking about good feelings? I mean, come on, that's awesome. All right, we're going to do a little bit different of a focus question today. I'm not doing it as a short answer type because I want to focus on content. So the first thing I want you to do is there's several terms that I want you to make sure that you're identifying in your notes prior to coming in. Okay, so I actually want you to take notes on what these things are because you're going to have to go back to them. So I want you to identify the era of good feelings, the American system, the Erie Canal, Henry Clay, the financial panic of 1919, the Cumberland Road, the Peculiar Institution, the Missouri Compromise, the Treaty of 1818. Oh, it's the financial panic of 1819. I knew that looked wrong. 1819, not 1919. My bad. Sorry. As well as John Quincy Adams. And then the written piece that I'm going to be collecting is, to what extent does the era of good feelings deserve its name? So is it really a time when everybody feels good? Is it a time of good feelings? Or is there some other stuff going on here? That's going to be what you're going to have to find out, because you got to remember this is a to what extent question, which means that your answer should be to a great extent, or to a little extent, to some extent, to a moderate extent. It's a measure. Is it a lot? Is it a little bit? Is it somewhere in between? And then your evidence is going to kind of define that. Okay? Ready to dive in? Good, let's go. So, era of good feelings. Okie dokie. So, we are starting with President James Monroe. He is going to be elected in 1820 as a Democratic Republican. This is after the Madison administration. He had worked during the Madison administration, and this is something that we want to keep in mind. Democratic Republicans. So John Adams was a Federalist. Thomas Jefferson was Democratic Republican. James Madison was Democratic Republican. James Monroe is a Democratic Republican. By this time, the Federalist Party has just about died. Okay, so there's essentially one political party, and everybody's kind of rallying around that political party. All right, doesn't mean they're not different views, but there is one political party. There's not two. So you don't have the bitter partisanship that we saw in the 1790s, where you have these two political parties that are vying for power. You don't have that same partisanship that we have today, where you have these two political parties with very different ideas kind of going at it. So the last Federalist candidate was put out there, and he lost. Okay, he only won 34 electoral votes to James Monroe's 183. Now that is something. Oh, it is 1816. I thought it was 1820. Okay, so, oh yeah, because 1824. Yeah, so Madison only served one term. Huh, I thought he served two. No, wait, let's see. Yeah, he served two, because he was elected first time in 1808, and then 1812 was a second term. So 1816 is when Monroe takes over. Yep, that's right. I'm sorry. I was just confused on the dates. So the last Federalist candidate is going to be out there. He only won 34 electoral votes. Monroe wins 183 electoral votes. It is a slam dunk. This is the greatest electoral victory since George Washington. Nobody's been able to touch that one yet. And, you know, to celebrate his win, he embarks on this tour of the country to inspect the defenses of the nation. But he's basically going around the country. And he's going around the country. It's basically kind of like a victory march. And he's going out to see the country. And everybody's going out to see him. He's greeted as a hero everywhere he goes. There's a lot of nationalism because, well, we didn't lose the war. We did not lose the War of 1812. We actually kind of won, so there's a lot of good feeling about, well, yeah, we went toe-to-toe with Britain. We went toe-to-toe with the greatest imperial power of the world, and we came out and we're still alive. On top of that, we got that one political party. There's not the divisive nature of partisanship. So Monroe is kind of greeted, and it's dubbed the era of good feelings. By the way, this is also the time when the Star-Spangled Banner was written, so we had our national anthem, and it's a good time to be an American. So, is everything great? No, of course not. There's going to be some problems. So, very early on in his administration, there's a financial panic. Let me show you. Let's see what these things look like. Okay. So, financial panics occur from time to time. Where's that graph? I need a graph. Crap. All right. Well, you can kind of. Oh, that's just 1970. Yeah, okay. So take a look here. This is basically like an economic graph showing how the economy is doing in the country. And you see how it goes up and down. Well, the boom times, this is called prosperity. Okay, this is when people have jobs and they have money and everything is good. Down here, the bad times, these are called financial panics or recessions or depressions. Okay, so these things happen periodically. The economy goes up, the economy goes down. When it's a downtime, when it's a bad time, people are losing jobs and people are losing money. When it's a good time, people have jobs and they have money. This happens from time to time, and we're going to be talking about, a lot about this in the 1900s, because about every 20 years there's going to be a financial panic, because they hadn't quite figured out yet how to take care of the economic system, so that didn't happen as much. We're starting to see it a little bit now because they've gotten away from controlling it so much, and it looks like our current president-elect is going to make it even worse, which means that we could see these things again. That wouldn't be a good thing. So there's a financial panic in 1819. The frontier, or the western lands, were expanding very rapidly. And Western banks were kind of being very free with them making their loans. They were lending money out to everybody. People came in and said, I need a loan. The banker would be like, you got any money? You got anything to pay it back? The guy would be like, no. And the bank says, okay, that sounds good to me. And they make that loan. Well, guess what? If you got a brother and your brother ain't got a job and he's never worked a day in his life and he asks you for money and promises to pay you back, and you lend him that money, are you ever going to see it again? Yeah, I didn't think so either. So you got to think like that. If you make a risky loan, it's only a matter of time until you start losing money, because people aren't going to be paying those loans back. And the banks were making loans that were just way too risky, and people were not paying them back, so the banks lost a lot of money. Now, the Bank of the United States was taking a look at these Western banks, and they're saying, what are you doing? You're loaning money to what? You loaned your money to your brother? Are you kidding me? You know what? You know that money that I lent you? Yeah, I need that money that I lent you back, because I'm afraid that I'm not going to get it back if I wait much longer, because you're lending money to your brother. So when the Bank of the United States called the loans on these banks out west, a lot of these banks had to close up because they just couldn't make their ends meet, because people weren't paying their debts. So these banks closed, and when the banks closed, that was it. You pretty much lost everything. And you had a lot of frontiersmen who were out there, and they lost their farms because the banks had to foreclose on their farms because the banks needed the money to pay back the Bank of the United States. So you had instances where you had towns where you had soup kitchens set up. And believe it or not, in the 19th century, it was illegal to be in debt. All right? So if you owed somebody money, that was actually illegal. And if you couldn't pay it, they sent you to prison. And they had debtors' prison set up. So not too nice, right? The poor, of course, are going to be the hardest hit because they don't have any cushion. And the poorer classes are going to have a lot of unrest. And they're going to blame the government for doing this. They're going to blame the bank for doing this. They're going to say the bank did this to us. The bank made us poor. The bank took our money. And that's going to feed into a lot of popular unrest. And we're going to see that come back when Andrew Jackson's going to come around. All right, let's talk about westward expansion in general. So the Northwest Ordinance back in 1787, this was under the Articles of Confederation. Remember that one good thing the Articles of Confederation did? Well, this was it. The Northwest Ordinance was a method that allowed new territories to be organized and admitted into the Union as full states with full rights, including congressional representation, such as having congressmen and senators. Every state has 2 senators. We got to remember that. So there's going to be a lot of new states that are going to be petitioning for statehood during this time because everybody's expanding so quickly. So Northerners are gaining more power and influence because there's a lot more population going into the northern cities. Industrialization starting there, wealth is there, but people are also moving west, and they're expanding rapidly. So as the West is expanding, there needs to be ways to get out there. They need to do things to kind of tie that region together. And they're going to start to look towards internal improvements. What are internal improvements? Internal improvements are things like roads, and are things like canals, basically projects to make it easier to get around from place to place. One of the greatest projects of this time was the Cumberland Road. It was a federal road that was commissioned to basically stitch together Maryland and go out to Illinois. And that is going to be something that's going to kind of bring the old colonies into the West, and it's going to bring everybody together. You had Generals Jackson and Harrison, 2 future presidents who are out west, and they're working to clear out the native threat, which means kill a whole bunch of Native Americans and make that land available for white people to live on. And then you have the Land Act of 1820. The Land Act of 1820 is going to authorize buyers to purchase 80 acres of land for $1.25 an acre. And that's going to basically going to get a lot of people to kind of want to move out there. There's going to be a lot of people that are going to be fighting for more internal improvements because they're going to want to make it easier to get back and forth between the new areas and the old areas. And you're also going to have people that are going to be like really angry against the Bank of the United States because they see the Bank of the United States is holding up progress because it's not making up more loans to people so that people can get out there. All right. So let's talk about internal improvements, and let's talk about Henry Clay. Henry Clay is a name you are going to hear over and over and over and over and over again for the next month or so. Henry Clay was an extremely influential congressman. He was a member of the House of Representatives. Later, he's a senator. He ran for president like 4 times, and he almost won a couple of them. Henry Clay is from Kentucky, and he's a Western congressman. And one of the things about the West is people living out West, they didn't have any infrastructure. They didn't have any roads. They didn't have any way to get around. So Henry Clay really wants to do things for the West to make it easier for people to get around. And he proposes his American system. Don't you love that name? It's just almost as good as the Era of Good Feelings, the American system. Who could ever vote against the American system? Why is your national duty to vote for the American system? Yeah, it didn't pass. All right, so what Clay wanted to do was he wanted to use a loose construction of the Constitution. Remember, loose construction means if the Constitution doesn't say it, then we can do it. Okay, and what he wants to do is he wants to use a loose construction of the Constitution to have the federal government fund projects that would basically be infrastructure projects between different areas. So Clay wants to stimulate trade and industry, and he sees building infrastructure as a way to do this. And today we know this. Today we know he was right. If you build it, it will generate business. Think about a train. If we put a train stop in your neighborhood, well, guess what? People are going to be around your neighborhood. Every time you get off a train stop, what's around that train stop? You got a pizza shop, you got a deli, you got a corner store, you got all that stuff. Why is all that stuff around a train stop? Because you get lots of foot traffic. that when you build stuff like infrastructure, people come through and it does stimulate trade. They didn't understand that quite as well back then. Also, there was this thing that, this sounded too much like Federalist. This sounded too much like the Federalist. He's advocating for a strong banking system to have good credit, and the Democratic Republicans are like, we don't like that that bank's a bad thing. He wanted a strong protective tariff to protect American industry, going back to Alexander Hamilton, right? He wants to basically foster northern industry, and then he wants to use the money from the tariff to build roads, canals, and internal networks of trade. Okay. Now, this ran all kinds of afoul with the Democratic Republicans, and he actually was a Democratic Republican, but he was more of a pragmatist. And they said, you know what, the federal government can't make money like this to pay for debts like this. It doesn't work that way. Today we do it, but back then it didn't. They saw it as a contradiction of the 10th Amendment. Now, because we couldn't get it through, the states were left to make their own internal improvements. And by internal improvements, we mean roads, canals, and things like that. And New York State is actually going to do the greatest internal improvement project of all, the Erie Canal. And we're going to do a whole big thing on that because it's huge. And that's going to be built in 1825. And that's going to stitch together New York City and New York State in the West, and that's going to be huge. But it's not going to be done on a federal level. And it's not going to be done on the federal level because they feel like it's a violation of their 10th Amendment. It's a violation of states' rights. And there was a lot of talk about states' rights and how states' rights have to be protected. All right, so as the country expanded, internal transportation networks became critical. They needed ways to connect the East Coast with the farms in the West. Canals and roads were the ways to seem to do it. Clay is calling for the American system, but nobody can agree how to pay for it. And they can't see the federal government as a way to make money to pay for it. It's a violation of the 10th Amendment. And it was just a hodgepodge way to do it, where the different states were kind of left to their own devices to make these internal improvements. So our economy was hurt, and we did not grow as rapidly as we should have during this time because the federal government was not facilitating that growth in trade through the construction of internal improvements. And this is something that is really going to be a legacy that's in a debate. The federal government has an enormous amount of ability to actually influence the economy and actually make sure that things grow. But this is when partisanship can really hurt the country. All right, so let's change gears a little bit and let's talk about that peculiar institution. One thing we haven't talked about a lot lately that's been going on is slavery. And, they hadn't talked about slavery very much because it was going on in the South, but that was pretty much it. But things are about to change. All right, so there is going to be a lot of trouble beneath the surface with slavery. 9 states had joined the Union since the founding of the nation, but it kind of worked out that way where you would have one state come in as a slave state and another state come in as a free state. Now, there's always this tension going back and forth between the North and the South. South has slaves, the North doesn't. The North knows the South has slaves, the North doesn't really say anything. A lot of people in the North, well, they don't care about, it's like they know it's a bad thing, but they just don't say it. But the problem is when it comes to power. If you have more states with slaves, or if you have more states without slaves, then states with slaves or states without slaves would have more power in Congress. Because every state gets 2 senators, and the Senate is the upper branch of Congress. Also, more people you have, the more representation you get. Now, the North is surging in terms of representation, so the North clearly has a lot more representatives. And the South is starting to get really worried. The South is really starting to get worried because, well, the North has a lot more representation in the House of Representatives. But the South is kind of, they're just struggling to keep the balance in the Senate. And the South is afraid that if there's more states without slaves than have slaves, then the Congress is going to go after slavery and there's nothing they can do about it. Now, this really comes to a head in 1819 when Missouri is petitioning for statehood as a slave state. Basically, that would make sure there would be more slave states than there were free states. And people in the North got a little afraid because they were afraid, well, the South is going to try to do something to make it so we can never go after slavery. So, in the House, there was proposed that the Talmadge Amendment to Missouri statehood, which basically stipulated that no more slaves could be brought into Missouri, and basically would provide gradual emancipation of slavery in that state. This is an opening salvo towards eliminating slavery, and it is seen as a northern measure to go after a southern way of life and southern slavery. And the South saw this as an affront to slavery. They saw it as an attack on the institution of slavery. And this was a federal government interfering with the states' rights. The South saw this as a state issue. If I want to keep slaves in my state, well, by golly, that is my right according to the Constitution. That's what the South is going to say. Now, this actually caused a huge issue because it was impacting the balance of power. So here we have a map here. I'm going to come back to that, but this shows slave states and slave territories, and this shows free territories. Oh, also, Missouri was the first state to be carved out of the old Louisiana Purchase. So this is going to be important because do we want to allow slavery in the Louisiana Purchase? What's going to come out of this is going to be known as the Missouri Compromise. The Missouri Compromise basically is going to be a compromise to maintain the balance of power between North and South. Now, the North is becoming richer and more powerful, and there's a lot more people in the North. So the South is really focused on maintaining this power in the Senate. So the compromise basically states that the Missouri was going to be taken in from the Louisiana Purchase as a slave state. Okay? And there will be no prohibitions on bringing in new slaves, or there will be no emancipation. Maine, which was part of Massachusetts before, is going to be brought in as a free state, maintaining that balance. So there's balance of 12 free states and 12 slave states. And then they established the 3630 line. The 3630 line is the southern border of Missouri. And they basically draw it across and they say anything after this that wants to come in south will be a slave state, and anything north will be a free state. And people go on with this because it looks like, okay, maybe they'll get 2 or 3 little slave states, and that's about it. And the North is like, okay, we'll get a bunch of free states, and eventually we'll be able to phase this slavery thing out, and it won't be a big issue. Boy, were they wrong, but that's a story for another day. So the Missouri Compromise avoids crisis over the issue of slavery for the time being. But this issue is going to come back, and it's going to come back a big way, and this is going to be the thing that explodes into the Civil War. Let's shift gears a little bit and talk about foreign policy. In 1818, there is a treaty with Britain. Basically, we were sharing New England fisheries with Canada and Britain, and this fixed the northern limits of the Louisiana Purchase. And we have a 10-year joint occupation of Oregon. So basically the Treaty of 1818 kind of works out this area up here. We kind of negotiate where this border is and stuff like that, and there's some economic stuff, kind of boring stuff. But basically, we're back on good terms with Britain again, and we can play nice and talk about borders with them. Florida. All right, Florida is a kind of a big issue. Andrew Jackson, General Andrew Jackson, in 1818, he is commissioned to go into western Florida and deal with Indian and slave problems. Basically, there were Native Americans in Florida, and a lot of Southerners were convinced those Native Americans were coming in and stealing their slaves to set them free. Florida was part of Spain at this time. So Jackson, Jackson's a little bit of a hothead, and he doesn't listen to orders that well. And, Spain controlled Florida, which is a foreign country. Yeah, Jackson kind of invaded a foreign country. He went into Florida, and not only did he deal with the slavery issue, but he actually arrested Spanish officials and put them on trial. They have them executed here. This is a major international incident that almost got us to war with Spain. And he's trying to seize Western Florida for the United States. Yeah, this was a bad issue. So to the rescue comes John Quincy Adams, son of President John Adams, Harvard-educated Secretary of State. And at the last second, he was able to negotiate a deal with Spain to kind of soothe over everything. And he negotiates basically Florida is going to be purchased for the United States in exchange for America giving up all rights in what is called Texas, which was then part of that. So basically, we take this area here, and then we buy all of Florida, and that's going to get ceded. All right, so let's go back to your focus question. Remember, there's a bunch of things you have to identify. Identify the era of good feelings, identify the American system, identify the Erie Canal, identify Henry Clay, the financial panic of 1819, the Cumberland Road, the peculiar institution, Missouri Compromise, Treaty of 1818, and John Quincy Adams. And the homework question to answer is, to what extent does the era of good feelings deserve its name? Was it really a good time? All right. Have a good break. I look forward to seeing you after the break. As always, if you have any questions, send me an email, and I'll be sure to get back to you. And don't have too much of a turkey coma. Bye, everybody.